All right, welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into something that, well, it doesn't just challenge how we see the world, it kind of completely dismantles it. We're stepping into the incredibly grim, super atmospheric world of the harsh mercy of absolute void. So buckle up, because we're about to go on this really dark, almost graphic novel-style philosophical journey that's going to totally reframe everything you thought you knew about purpose and, honestly, destruction. Okay, just listen to this opening line for a second. A gardener does not mourn the weeds he burns to clear the soil. That striking thought comes from our narrator, a figure known only as the Cold Observer. And man, right off the bat, that sets a seriously grim, uncompromising tone, doesn't it? It instantly hooks us into this dark worldview where total ruin isn't viewed as a tragedy at all. It's just necessary maintenance. So what are we really talking about here? We're talking about nihilism, but hold on, not just as some depressing buzzword you hear thrown around. The text defines it specifically as the realization that the universe is stripped entirely bare of illusion and external purpose. As we dig into the language of this fable, kind of acting like dark philologists for a bit, I really want you to notice how the destruction of meaning isn't actually the end. Paradoxically, it's the very first, albeit terrifying, step toward true existential freedom. Moving into Section 1, The Cold Observer's Void and the Descent of the Old World. The observer describes this failing moral order with some really visceral, incredibly Nietzschean imagery. They say the kingdom they cherished was already dead. It was merely a corpse refusing to rot. I mean, wow. Look at the sheer, desperate denial that highlights. It's a society clinging to a dead structure, totally wrapped up in the illusion of its own importance, and just flat out refusing to let nature take its natural destructive course. Now, this brilliantly illustrates how the observer actually justifies all this. Over on one side, you've got the comforting lie, right? A society completely suffocated by the rigid silk of its laws and the gold of its debts. But on the flip side, you have the honest nothingness. See, by bringing in a clean void and leaving literally nothing but ash, the observer isn't actually punishing anyone. They're just stripping away those false, heavy chains. To really wrap our heads around this philosophy, we're going to look at three specific case studies from the text, essentially three parables. Just picture these settings for a second. The absolute deepest cavern of a dead mountain, an iron lighthouse out on a jagged reef, and a fissure of ice buried far beneath the sun. You kind of notice the theme there, right? Every single subject we're about to meet is completely, profoundly isolated in a totally hostile and utterly indifferent environment. All right, that brings us to Section 2, The Blind Weaver's Delusion and the End of the King. So our first parable sets this incredibly somber scene. We've got a blind weaver who literally spends a century alone in a dead mountain. He's memorizing every single knot of this massive silver tapestry because he fully, wholeheartedly believes he's mapping the stars for a king who's going to return one day. But then, well, reality hits. The great silence falls, a random stray ember drifts into the cave, and in just a few moments, 100 years of intense, devoted labor just dissolves into a handful of gray soot. Now, the absolute most crucial part of this is how the weaver actually reacts to this total devastation. When he reaches out into the dark and feels literally nothing but cold stone, the text hits us with something super profound. The king wasn't dead. The king had actually never existed in the first place. And get this. The weaver doesn't weep, he doesn't scream. He just sits there in the pitch black. That comforting lie is completely gone, and he finally realizes that the thread, all that labor, his entire purpose, it had only ever belonged to him. Moving right along to Section 3, The Iron Beacon's Graveyard and the End of the Empire. Now we're scaling up from one person's delusion to this massive, multi-generational illusion. Picture generations of lighthouse keepers burning their own furniture, and eventually, shockingly, even their own bones, just to keep this flame alive. They are absolutely terrified that without it, the great ships of the empire are going to crash against the rocks. But when the ash finally settles, what does the last keeper actually see out there? Nothing. Zero ships. Just this vast, empty sheet of black glass stretching all the way to the horizon. The empire had vanished centuries ago. This whole time, they were quite literally signaling to a graveyard. There's this incredible dark beauty in what happens next. You'd think, realizing his entire ancestral purpose was just a total phantom, that the keeper would throw himself into the sea in despair, right? But he doesn't. He simply blows out the flame. He sits down in the dark. And for the very first time in his life, he actually listens to the beautiful, unbothered music of the waves. It's this profound acceptance of the void, a truly peaceful resignation to the quiet. Which leads us to Section 4, the Frozen Seeds Rebellion, and the end of the gods. Okay, this is where that quiet acceptance we just saw completely transforms into this chaotic, almost violent rebirth. So, step 1, our little frozen seed does exactly what it's supposed to do, right? It prays, it begs the soil, the rain, and the sky to please melt the ice so it can fulfill its grand purpose and become an oak tree. Literally 1,000 years go by like this. Then, step 2 is this crushing realization. The sky stays gray, and the seed finally understands that no spring is ever coming, and absolutely no God is listening in the dark. And then, step 3, it just stops waiting. It gathers up all of its fragile, bitter strength, and it violently cracks its own shell against the frost. And you have to understand, the motivation behind this is just staggering. It does this, quote, not to reach the sun, but simply to prove to the ice that it could break itself. I mean, wow, that right there, that is the ultimate Nietzschean triumph of this entire fable. The seed isn't growing towards some warm, external, heavenly light anymore. It is forcefully, violently creating its own meaning, its own chaotic purpose, entirely in the freezing dark. Let's bring it all together in Section 5, the weight of absolute freedom and the synthesis. So, at the end of all this, the cold observer asks a question that we really need to sit with for a second. Do you see the thread that binds these miseries together? Really think about it. Think about our blind weaver sitting in that dead cave, our insanely dedicated lighthouse keeper out on the reef, and our frozen, rebellious little seed. What is the actual common denominator of all their suffering? The answer lies in what the text calls the cages of duty. See, the observer's whole argument is that these subjects didn't suffer because the universe was just out to get them or inherently cruel. Not at all. They suffered because they stubbornly, desperately demanded that the world possess a purpose. Just to fill the terrifying quiet of existence, they literally invented masters. They invented kings to justify mapping those stars. They invented empires to justify keeping that flame alive. And they invented gods to justify waiting around in the frost. So you realize the observer's silence didn't actually break any of these people. All it did was shatter their comforting lies, those heavy delusions of purpose and duty. By just letting the tapestry burn and letting the beacon die out, the observer exposed the absolute nothingness underneath it all. The core thesis of this whole fable is that this honest nothingness, just the ash and the void, is actually the only truly honest thing these beings have ever known. And guys, here is where the philosophical hammer really drops. The observer actually calls this total destruction a harsh mercy. And why a mercy? Well, because, quote, until you accept that your labor means absolutely nothing to the cosmos, you can never truly possess the terrifying freedom to exist for yourself. And that right there is the ultimate takeaway. When you finally strip away all the kings, the empires, and the gods, what are you actually left holding? You're holding the one gift you probably never even wanted, the absolute crushing weight of your own choices. Look, I know it's a super dark, gothic fable for sure, but it leaves us with this incredibly provocative thought. Are you just living in a comfortable cage of duty? Or are you finally ready to embrace the terrifying, beautiful freedom of the void? It's definitely something to think about. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer today, and I'll catch you next time.